Let's get to the last session on the economic incidence of the corporate tax. Professor Arnold Harberger of the University of California, Los Angeles, and a professor emeritus at the University of Chicago is our first speaker, and it's a great honor to welcome him to the podium.
Well, thank you very much. I'm happy to be here, as I guess we all are. I'm going to try to be as expeditious as possible in this presentation. Thinking about this business of known and knowable and unknowable, I want to say that on the subject of incidents, the real place where incidence lives is in our heads. It doesn't live in the real world. It's something that we construct examples of in order for us to be able to think clearly. When you do general equilibrium analysis and you say you're going to impose a tax, you can't. You have to know how it's going to be spent or what's going to be done with it. Well, since there are a million ways in which you can spend and do, there you got a million dissertations already. And now you have a question of what about the other distortions that are present in the economy? Well, there's another million alternatives that you can have. So you got a million squared alternative ways of analyzing one single tax, maybe the tax on cigarettes, let alone a corporation income tax. And then when we get to the corporation income tax, we're interested in the long-run effects. When the whole economy has fully adjusted and come down to an equilibrium, what about all the way to there, you see? So you can see that, and we have to do it. What do? We make a demand neutrality assumption in which we assume the government spends the money just the same way the consumers would have spent it, and then we can handle it. And I think that's a wonderful convention. And it doesn't really limit us much because we can have two modules. We can have a module in which we have the tax with the demand neutrality assumption, and then we have another module in which we give up the package of spending the government does under demand neutrality, and we have it build an airport or a port or whatever, spend on Iraq. But what I'm saying here is that we inevitably are living in a world of stylized experiments in which we're using models of our own making. And I say that these models have to be based on absolute fundamentals and have to be kind of as spare and simple as possible, because as you make them more complicated in the vain to attempt to replicate the full real world, you quickly get to the point where you invert those matrices and whatever came out, you just cannot understand. I mean, you just there is no understanding there. Our brains are not capable of doing it. So that's just by way of introduction. Now, in talking about incidents, I want to emphasize a couple of things. One is that overbearing of taxes is an extremely important and much neglected story. Second thing is that open and closed economy stories in connection with the corporation income tax and maybe other taxes should be thought of as alternative sensible scenarios in the same real world. So those are my two stories. It isn't open versus closed economy. It's what is the nature of the disturbance we're analyzing. So as an example of overbearing, I'm going to put this graph on the board because this is an import tariff. That demand curve is the demand curve for the importable good. The supply curve is the domestic supply of import substitutes. And what we're doing is analyzing the effect of putting a tariff of T. And you can see that consumers lose all of this. The factors who lie behind the supply curve gain this part here, and the government gets only this. So consumers vastly overbear the burden of this tariff, and this was known like 200 years ago and has been well known to international trade economists forever and ever. But somehow when we do incidents, we say, how are we going to allocate that tariff? That's not right. Now, in closed economy story, this graph summarizes most of what I think is the important story of this and another graph of my 1962 paper, that you start with equilibrium in the capital market at a 9% rate. You impose a 50% tax on capital income in X, and that leads to a new equilibrium in which we have less capital in X and more capital in Y. In the process, the rate of return in Y has gone down to 6%. That equals the net rate of return in X. But gross of tax, of course, the rate has gone up to, marginal productivity has gone up to 12%. And the green area is what the government collects. The upper little rectangle there is what demanders of X are paying extra. The red rectangle below is a gain to the government and a loss to capital in X. And this other big rectangle is a loss to capital that is located in Y, but since that rate of return has gone down, that capital has lost that much. But who gains here are the demanders of the product of Y. So that's that story. Then we have incidence extremes, which is the same kind of a story. Here we have a case where the marginal productivity schedule of capital in Y is completely elastic. So when capital moves in, the rate of return doesn't go down. That means that the full burden of the tax gets to be passed on to the demanders of X. The opposite case is where the infinite elasticity is in the X industry, and there, as capital is shoved out of the X industry, it has to go down to the point where it has fallen to 4.5% from 9%, and capital bears much more than the full burden of the tax. The loss to capital is these two rectangles. The gain to the government is just one. So the big story of my 1962 paper in my own mind is that where people used to think of what piece of the tax revenue was borne by consumers and what piece was pushed back to labor and what piece was borne by the shareholders, the idea was, no, it's not shareholders, it's all capital owners who are doing whatever bearing there is to be borne, and that it isn't that these are three pieces adding up to 100%. The part borne by just this one factor can easily be greater than 100%. And the plausible limits are not from 0 to 100, but from like 33 to 200 or something like that. Okay. I tell the story in the paper, which I don't have time here to repeat, of how I finally, by dint of my students' questions, was forced to think in terms of open economy incidents. And I first started with a two-sector model in which we just had those same sectors X and Y, and I first made one of them tradable and I made the other one tradable, and imposed that the tradable commodities were price takers in the world market. The country was a price taker, and the country was a price taker in the capital market. And that led to extremes of incidents that looked like the ones I just showed you, except that it was labor that was the one that was overbearing the tax instead of capital. But there were many things that I didn't like about that model, and I told it to my classes as a story, kind of, but not with my usual real-world fervor, kind of. And But finally, when Arturo Fernandez was doing his thesis in Chicago, we stumbled upon a fourfold categorization and a way of thinking which I call my epiphany in that area, because it opened my eyes and it made me want to sell, so to speak, the idea rather than just use it as a classroom example. So the story is of four sectors: corporate tradables, that's manufacturing; corporate non-tradables, that's, I call it public utilities and transport. You can include finance, I guess, in there. Then you have non-corporate tradables, I say agriculture. And then you have non-corporate, non-tradables, services. So you got these nice, identifiable, intuitive sectors to talk about. And here is the tradable, non-tradable corporate sector only here. I don't know if I can get enough room. Not there. Put it up there. Corporate sector only. What happens? These are price formation equations that are being represented here. The world price is given. Wages and net return are what make up the price if we don't have a corporation income tax. When we have a corporation income tax, damn it, that price can't go up. That net return can't go down. So if there is to be an equilibrium, it has to be through wages going down. You may be driven to a corner. That whole industry may disappear. But if it's going to be there, it's supposed to function like this. The non-tradable corporate sector, public utilities and transport, doesn't have this trouble with the world price being given. So, and it happens to be, I think, considerably more capital intensive than is manufacturing. So, the story there is that wages go down as dictated in the manufacturing sector. And the net return then has to go up by enough. The price has to go up by enough to give a normal net return to capital at the new rate and at the same rate as before, and with taxes taking up that part of the difference. Then when we get to the non-corporate sector, what we have is, in agriculture, tradable. There's a problem here that I don't have time to go into, but we made a leap over the chasm by assuming capital doesn't go to agriculture, reproducible capital doesn't go to agriculture, but land is there. And so what happens in agriculture when wages go down, land rents go up, so landowners are gainers. And what happens in services when wages go down, the consumers of services benefit. So here we've got a four-sector economy, everything kind of makes sense, and I became pleased with this frame. Now, in thinking about open and closed economies, I've been teaching the two models now for something over 20 years. And I always tell my students, look, if all the countries of the world raise or lower their corporate taxes at the same time and by roughly the same amount, it's a closed economy model that you want. If one or a small number of countries do that same thing, it's an open economy model. It's always an open economy in the sense we live in an open economy, but we can have a scenario which I think is reasonably approximated by what has happened over the past couple decades of corporate tax rates going down pretty generally across the world. So in a broad sense, I would say the closed economy model could follow that story. And if one country were to do it alone, if even a big country like the US were to do it alone, you want to put it in an open economy setting. So this is, I think, a very important thing for us as a profession to somehow internalize. It's a very simple point. I've never had anybody say, "Oh no, you're wrong," when I say that. But damn it all, people keep talking as if somehow one model or the other is going to be right. Another thing that comes out of this simple scenario business is that you really have a problem when you go to something like allocating the incidence of the U.S. tax. Under which scenario am I allocating the incidence of the U.S. tax? And, I really don't know under what scenario. Okay. Now, I think I will go to an illustrative incidence exercise, which is one of the tables in my paper. And what we're doing here is pursuing incidence of the tax in an open economy setting in which the U.S. has market power in the world, in the capital market of the world, which I believe it certainly does. So what happens as a consequence then of imposing the tax in the U.S. is that the world interest rate, world rate of return goes down. Now, to calibrate this, I sort of took a midpoint of the old closed economy model, which had capital fully bearing the tax. And I said, well, now, instead of U.S. capital bearing the tax, we're going to make this example so that world capital bears the tax. So the actual receipts of the tax by the U.S. government is matched by losses of capital throughout the world. But how much of that takes place in U.S. manufacturing? Only 1/8, according to my numerical example. This is not supposed. It's a simulation I pulled the numbers out of the air. I didn't try to do empirical work, but they're roughly, orders of magnitude okay. So 1/8 of the burden is borne by capital in manufacturing, and another 1/8 is borne by capital in public utilities and transport within the United States. And 1/8 of the receipts in the sector is 1/16 of the total corporate capital receipts. And then we don't have reproducible capital in agriculture, so reproducible capital in services is bearing the rest. So over the whole U.S. economy, 1/4 of the burden of the tax is borne. And then we figure out what happens with labor, and the problem is that this 1/8 loss of that. Remember, we had what we had with 9% rate of return. The world rate of return went down by 1, so now capital in manufacturing is getting 8%. It's a 50% tax, so the gross return has to be 16%. But that extra 7/8, whatever it is, 7 percentage points, that can't go into price because it's a tradable product. So it has to be borne by labor. Wages of labor have to be pushed down, and when they go down in manufacturing, they have to go down throughout the whole economy. So they go down in manufacturing enough to just cover the tax paid in manufacturing. But by the time you spread that over the whole economy, it turns out that labor ends up bearing more than twice total U.S. corporation income tax receipts. Then we have consumers benefiting losing through the rise in the price of public utilities, gaining from the lower price of services, And then we allocate these consumer benefits between capital, labor, and landowners, and we end up in this example with U.S. labor bearing 130% of total corporate tax revenues, and landowners and U.S. capital being both gainers in the case of capital, in their role as consumers. Then, stimulated by the paper by Jane and her co-author, I decided that I would incorporate something that I have talked about in class a lot, and indeed talked about in my earlier paper on this subject a bit, namely that manufacturing goods are differentiated, and they are not cases of a pure price taker thing. It's not copper or something like that we're talking about. And so what I did in this example was to assume that of that remaining 7/8, that's 7 percentage points that we had to distribute it, 3 of them came out in the rising price of manufactured products, and the rest still pushed manufacturing wages down, and through that, the rest of the economy wages down. And when we follow through this entire exercise, we come to U.S. labor bearing 96% instead of 130% of the burden. And with U.S. capital actually, in this case, bearing some of the burden, and the excess over 100% of all this goes to U.S. landowners. All of these cases incorporate their role as consumers. If I were to write a new set of rules for talking about this subject, I would really separate the effects on factors from the effects on consumers. The effect on labor is coming from a labor market, but some laborers might not buy many tradable goods or many manufactured goods or whatever. People would differ in their tastes a lot in their roles as demanders, and I don't think there's any reason why we shouldn't just say, well, when the price of something goes up, it's the people who buy that bear it, and when the price of something goes down, it's the people who buy that are the beneficiaries. Okay, well, in order to keep on track, what I'm going to do is just go through the summary and conclusions that I have here, and I'll talk about each point as we make it. The world never gives us a clean incidence scenario. I talked about that. If we want to answer a really real-world question, we have to think of inserting our tax change into a setup where we clearly specify how the proceeds are likely to be spent and what other distortions will be present. Well, we can do that in a given specific case, but we can't write a textbook on that subject. So from a textbook writing point of view, this is unknowable. In order to do a standard incidence analysis, we have to have a convention, and I think the convention of no other distortions plus the assumption of demand neutrality is pretty much what we have followed, and I think it's a very good convention. But even when we do this, we have to sharply distinguish between closed economy scenario, where all major countries do whatever is being done to the tax, and an open economy scenario in which only one or a few countries do it. Then we come to the 4-sector analysis that we've talked about, and now we're coming to other things. I make a major point of the wisdom of building models in which rates of return are, quote, equalized around the world. For a small economy, it means that its country risk premium, which can generate a difference in rates of return, the country risk premium will be no different with or without a CIT. And in the text, I talk also about the fact that when we model this small open economy, I want to model it basically with balanced trade, without the tax, and then balanced trade with the tax. I don't want to have screwing up there. There is an issue where capital moves abroad as a consequence of the tax. You have the income that could be coming in from that capital, which would lead to a change in the real exchange rate, but a change in the price of tradables versus non-tradables, I don't think of as having a profound influence on the incidence in the dimensions that we are talking about. I say that with a little bit of trepidation, however. It isn't that I'm asserting it with 100% Bayesian confidence. So in the small open economy, then, you really have this capital market rate is given, and for them, I think the manufactured story is going to be one mainly of being a price taker too. So I think that kind of the unmodified original model maybe applies better to the small open economy. In an economy that looks something like the US, we have that example that you saw, where labor more than bears the full amount of the tax, yet owners of capital all over the world also bear the full amount of the tax. Overbearing, remember. And what's happening? To the extent that rates of return fall elsewhere, labor elsewhere is the gainer. And to the extent that we have labor bearing more than the full burden here, we have mainly, it is the consumers of non-tradable sector products, consumers of services, who are the beneficiary and counterpart of that. I then talk about the case that we reviewed where the country is not a complete price taker for manufactured goods. Labor ends up with 96% of the burden in that example, and worldwide capital bears 100%. I didn't make an example with the price of manufactured goods going up by enough to take out the whole weight of this extra burden, so to speak. Why not? Because it leads to a sort of an inconsistency in the picture. You push that thing up, and you nonetheless are going to have that in the manufactured sector of the economy, there's going to be an incentive to reduce the use of capital because of scale, and there's going to be an incentive to reduce the use of capital from a substitution effect. So you're going to be ejecting capital, and it has to be absorbed somewhere, either here or elsewhere. And in order to be absorbed with any plausible elasticity, the rate has to go down, and I would say has to go down generally. Okay. Now, I was specifically asked to talk about the paper by Gravel and Smetters, and I have sort of mixed feelings about that paper in the sense that I really, welcome that modeling. I mean, it isn't that it's just good. I think it's great that they did it, and it is this kind of a spare, fundamentals-based model of the kind that I was calling for. It's exactly kind of what this doctor ordered anyway. And my only argument comes really nothing about the underlying economics, but sort of the subliminal messages that are being transmitted through the selection of which parameter combinations are being displayed in the tables. So what's the big story? Cobb Douglas being as convenient as it is, I view it tolerantly. But from the time, Bob Lucas did his thesis in my workshop in the 1960s, measuring the elasticity of substitution between labor and capital in U.S. manufacturing. And he found that 0.5 was a better central tendency than 1. And I remain convinced by that, and I think there's other evidence that when you have high labor costs, you have a share of labor tending to go up rather than to go down, which is another indication of an elasticity less than 1. So I don't have any problem with going less than 1 from 1. And in general, that is not a problem. Where I have the biggest trouble with Gravel-Smetter's numbers is in their assumptions about portfolio substitution, where basically, kind of, you take their conclusion that U.S. labor or U.S. capital is bearing most of the tax, but the rate of return abroad doesn't go down much. That tells a story that I don't find plausible. It's just straightforward. I think that the fluid connections in the world capital market, where billions of dollars every day flow between the US and UK and Europe and Japan, and what are these? These are the big banks and financial houses pursuing via covered interest arbitrage 1/8% or 1/16% in return. That you can't make a penny in those markets by trying to arbitrage, you and me, because the big boys have it done to the point where there is no margin whatsoever for us to pay a commission and gain anything. So I say that kind of fluidity in that branch of the capital market, to me, is sufficient. In my yearning to keep our story simple, trying to stick to fundamentals, I say when that connection exists, I'm going to believe that the general levels of rates of return are going to be equalized, in quotes, that is not be made different because of the existence of a corporate tax somewhere or somewhere else. The general rate will go down, but differentials, I don't believe, will emerge. So that's that kind of story. On the product differentiation side, I made my example intentionally to recognize it, intentionally to give what I thought was a reasonably generous allowance for it. But then comes this question of how much substitutability. And I think that the authors there may have been a little bit mesmerized by thinking of an elasticity of substitution of 3 as a high number. An elasticity of substitution of 3 between two things means that their separate own price elasticities add up to 3. So their average own price elasticity is 1.5. And 1.5 implies huge market power. Huge market power. And so I have grave worry about having such an elasticity. There's another question about how you're going to interpret that thing. How does that substitution work? I think the substitution works mainly when Ford and General Motors cars go up and other ones stay constant, or when the U.S. Cell phones go up and the European and Japanese cell phones stay constant, that kind of thing. So I think that as you think of, we're talking about a general rise in the price of these goods, or at least I'm thinking in those terms, but asking where does that substitution really take place? And I think it takes place in these kind of pairwise or semi-pairwise linkings, and in each of which I think the substitutability is high, and hence I would say the aggregate substitutability I also would think to be high. Now, coming to the end. On the subject of short-run and transitional incidents, I find the idea of the immediate impact being borne by the immediate residual claimants, equity owners, to be quite acceptable, but it doesn't teach us much. It, by definition, creates a capital market disequilibrium in which the capital in the area, equity owners in the area taxed have just been kind of screwed, and now capital wants to go away from there. So now we have to say, how is this disequilibrium going to be resolved, and over what period of time? Well, we can make models in which such and such a fraction of the gap is covered in any given period and stuff like that. We have had many such models over time, but I don't think we know much about these transitions. I don't think it's going to be one of the hardest things ever to find out about. So let's put that in the category of the unknowable. The transition between the immediate short-run impact and the long-run impact, which has been the focus of most of our work on incidence. Dynamic incidence is somewhat more tractable if one is ready to consider the time path of the total capital stock to be independent of the tax. I don't mind doing that. It isn't that I feel terribly happy doing that, but I don't. I'm with Jane here in being on the pessimistic side for high elasticities of saving, and I think another thing though, when we find an assumption that really helps our analysis a lot, we have to love it, you know. if we don't make use of these things that give us an analytical lever, we will quickly get nowhere. So there we can just have a rolling comparative static model where labor and capital are growing through time and where technical advance is taking place at the same time, but each period we are in full comparative static equilibrium as we go along. No problem. Our old friend comparative static model comes to our rescue. When savings become endogenous, you have still a ray of hope, because there is a significant subclass of models that lead to an equilibrium of usually the same rate of growth as without, but with a ratio of capital to other factors smaller. So you end up with that equilibrium ratio, and you can get an answer. How does the world look without the tax with a higher ratio of capital to labor? How does it look with a lower tax with a lower ratio of capital to labor? And again, a kind of a rolling equilibrium, and that's not a bad answer. If, however, we want dynamic results based on solid knowledge about people's savings behavior, I think we would have to use the term unknown, if not unknowable. And I will stop there.
We're at that little technical transformation here. But the first discussant will be Professor Malcolm Gillis. He's the university professor and the Irvin Zingler Professor of Economics at Rice University. He is also the former president of Rice University.
Thank you very much. And I have to congratulate the organizers. They not only went out and rounded up the usual suspects, but they got a few new perpetrators as well, and I congratulate them. And by the way, I'm sorry Joel is not here, Joel Slimrod. 30 years ago exactly, Joel was my TA in public finance. I got to tell you, he's the best TA in public finance I ever had. He said, "Why didn't you tell me that before when I was your TA?" I said, "Well, it wouldn't have made any difference then, because we didn't either one of them we didn't have any experience. It wouldn't have been worth anything." Okay, given the fact that I knew there were going to be some younger economists here today, I took as my assignment the provision of historical perspective on this latest Harberger contribution on incidence, because I want to show how his work affected thinking on this matter over 4 decades. I began interacting with Al just 2 years after earning my PhD, and at that time, I have to tell you, much of economics was still unknown to me. And in the ensuing decades, I was his sidekick, probably for comic relief, sidekick at a variety of venues, including Colombia and Venezuela, Colombia, Bolivia, and Indonesia. And because of that experience, the whole new areas of economics became known to me. But I've been learning from Al Harberger ever since '62, when I first read his very persuasive analysis on the futility of the mineral depletion allowance, even before I saw his incidence paper. By the way, Al, I presented your results at a conference 10 years later that I agreed with in Arizona, and was almost run out of Phoenix. Really, it was awful. Well, this master mentor has also, during his career, transformed study and analysis, not just in public finance, but in project evaluation and international trade and economic development. We know for sure that Al has mentored dozens, hundreds, I would say, of dozens of finance and economy ministers and hundreds of professors all over the world. But we know that. But unknowable is the number of economists worldwide that he's won over through his example to the practice of what he's always called good economics. And I would put that number somewhere in the tens of thousands. I wish it was in the hundreds of thousands or millions. But the exact number, of course, will never be known, and practitioners of good economics all over the world are very content with this inexactitude, because following Al, they are well aware that for many things in economics, precision is ordinarily not possible at any price. And there's a lot to be learned from Al's latest contribution under discussion today. I take his paper first to be an eloquent plea for pursuing the essence of truly important questions in a world in which precision cannot be bought except at probably prohibitive costs, if at all. This is what Al was seeking, I think, in generation 1 of the Harberger models for tax incidence, that is, how the effects of the tax plays out in a 2-sector closed economy with capital mobile between sectors under plausible parameter values. That was generation 1. Generation 2, of course, was his early work on the open economy model, while generation 3 appeared after 1980 with his 4-sector model. In all of these cases, he's remained squarely on message. We do well when we devise and deploy lean incidence models that enfold only the most salient and relevant aspects of the real world, using the models to focus on a limited number of well-specified scenarios that are both significant and teachable, rather than on all possible scenarios. Now, younger economists might ask why I dwell some on this matter. Not long ago, not nearly all economists were fully clear on this point. In the 1970s, for example, many believed that advances in modeling and computation would very soon allow rather precise answers to practically all vital questions, whether in macro forecasting or incidence analysis. I remember all too well several endless lunches in the mid-70s at the Harvard Faculty Club with a very bright, highly regarded economist who'd returned to campus after completing 2 years on the Council of Economic Advisors, where he was absolutely enthralled by the exploratory and explanatory possibilities of very large models. Now, at that time, I knew, or thought I knew, a good bit about the workings of many world commodity markets, including those for timber and minerals and grains. My frequent lunch companion, Alan, you know who I'm talking about, and I'll reveal it in private. My frequent lunch companion, it was almost a household name, ceaselessly pumped me for information on these commodity markets in the search of improving, in his words, I'll improve 1 or 2 more terms in equations in my macro model so that my forecast will be spot on. Okay? He truly believed then that precision in this pursuit was possible at a very cheap price. That was, in this case, paying for my lunches. And he was by no means alone in this belief. Now, by contrast, the profession has learned immensely from the large body of Al's work, especially, including that on incidence. The Harberger model Generation 1 awakened the economics profession to the theretofore unrecognized truth that for a closed economy, the longer-term incidence of corporate tax was on all capital income in the taxing economy, not just capital employed in the corporate sector, and that capital bore more than 100% of the burden of the tax. And this result obtained under any plausible assumptions for the relevant elasticities of product or factor substitution. However, the efficiency costs of the tax would vary greatly according as to whether the relevant elasticities were large or small. The Harberger view fairly quickly displaced a competing view that was based on some not-so-good econometrics. And in that view, the full burden of the tax was shifted forward to consumers in the form of higher prices. Now, that was Generation 1. Now, in those days, not many people asked many questions about the effects of openness on anything, including incidence. Or not many people asked very many questions about capital mobility, because the profession as a whole in the 60s and the 70s tended to view U.S. foreign trade as relatively negligible, certainly in their model building and their textbooks, and they tended to view capital as relatively immobile internationally. Now, when in the 70s, Al demonstrated that incidence in the open economy was a horse of quite another color, the profession largely agreed, but at first they didn't pay a lot of attention to the implications, whether policy or otherwise. And that was because over time there had developed what I think was a very bad habit among economists, and that was this widespread tendency to treat capital as immobile internationally. Later, though, with Harberger II and a slowly growing recognition of the international mobility of capital, it became apparent that for the U.S., labor would, according to Harberger II, overbear the brunt of the burden of the tax and ends up bearing, of course, much more than 100% of the tax burden. That doesn't even include excess burdens or efficiency costs. Now, that was in the initial versions. Over the next decade or so, the economics profession, or at least the public finance subset, slowly but almost completely came around to the view that the assumption of international immobility of capital is pretty much counterfactual. When properly measured, the evidence that capital is mobile across borders, I believe, far outweighs the contrary evidence. It did then and it does now, I think. So it was that with Harberger II, it became widely recognized that migrating capital would largely escape the tax burden. The conclusions of the Harberger model Generation 1 now, the closed economy model, they now with these, a lot of the profession said that's inapplicable for all time. But were they inapplicable? Here, just as in the case of many in the Federal Reserve System in the past 10 years, the profession maybe learned too much. The Fed learned too much from a decade of Japanese deflation. Okay, and I think the profession maybe have learned a little too much from generation 2 of the Harberger model. Why? Because beginning in the early 80s, the pace of tax reform worldwide quickened very notably, with many similarities in the various reform programs. And I note parenthetically that Al had a hand directly, as in Indonesia, or indirectly, as in the U.S. or many Latin American countries, in many of these programs. His influence on these reforms was just impressive. And so it was that governments in developed and developing countries moved away from steeply progressive rates of income tax. Notably, between just the decade after 1984, no less than 35 countries from the U.S. to Indonesia, Ghana, and Mexico governments adopted much simplified taxes imposed at much lower, flatter rates. And this movement enfolded capital taxes as well, including, in virtually all reforming countries, corporate income taxes. For this period, the appropriate model for understanding incidence in the reforming countries was not Harberger Generation 2, as Al said, but Harberger Generation 1, the closed economy model. As he has explained in many settings since then, when all countries, or even just a few big ones, comprising most of the world economy, select lower corporate tax rates in roughly parallel fashion over, say, 4 to 7 years, the best model to use would not be the one where capital can successfully flee the sting of corporate tax rates, but rather the closed economy one. Now, Harberger 3 emerged around 1980 and has been successfully tweaked many times since. And I'm not going to spend a great deal of time explaining or critiquing the latest member of the family of Harberger incidence models. Al does this himself far better than I can in the space of a few pages. Still, it needs saying that the 4-sector Generation 3 model stands as one more of his enduring gifts to the economic profession and the practice of good economics. I mean, what do you use it for? You can use generation. You want to consider what might happen should a small open economy like Chile reduce its rate of corporate tax? The 4-sector model is easily applicable to that scenario. Are you concerned about capital reallocation in the large country case, as when the U.S. increases or decreases corporate tax rates? Now you find, with differentiated products in the corporate manufacturing sector, both additional complexity, but also much richer conclusions than is possible in Harberger Generation 2. Here, now with an increase, capital bears a sizable burden of the fraction of the tax. Prices of manufactured goods do rise, and labor share is adversely affected on both the income sources and the income usage side. Al closes this contribution with some timely reminders concerning the time path of adjustment when tax rates are changed. Totally in character, he places a high premium on essence and a low premium on the search for basically unknowable details. When the tax is changed, will the results work themselves out in 2 years or 5 or 10 or 20? For a very small tax change in economies with rapid depreciation rates and few stranded assets, the expected adjustments might be as short as a year or 2. Contrarily, for a major tax change in an economy with slow depreciation and a lot of stranded assets, a decade-long transition might be required. So I would sum up by saying that the master mentor has struck yet again. And to understand what Al has meant all these years by the phrase good economics, you could not do better than going over this paper several times. I, for one, eagerly await Generation 4 and 5 of the Harberger family of incidence models, as he helps us peel back zones of ignorance.
Thank you, Michael. And last for the day is Jane Gravel of the Congressional Research Service.
And I want to say what I should have said when I commented on Larry's paper, which is that my views are not the views of the Congressional Research Service. Professor Harberger, I am very honored to be discussing your paper, and I am very, very grateful for any kind words that you said about the work that we did. It really means a great deal to me. I'm very humbled. to be in this situation. But that doesn't mean that I'm not going to disagree with you. However, going carefully through your paper, and also, actually, we had already begun to do that because an editor, where we think we're going to get our paper published, had urged us to really go through and outline the differences between your model and our model. I learned some important things, and I think they are very important to this kind of modeling. So, there we go. So, I want to talk about, well, we can have many kind of paradigms, but as an academic, it's fun to play with all these paradigms. But as someone who's trying to advise policymakers, I have to try to give it my best shot, what I think is really known, or my best guess on, even for things that are not knowable. So I really do want to try to answer the question of does domestic labor bear the burden in an open economy? And there are 4 issues I'd like to discuss. The first is factor intensities of the tradable sector, which turns out to be quite important. The second is the issues of portfolio and product substitutions. The third is the issue of debt finance, and the fourth is whether we should be using, and we know we have an open economy, but I think you're perfectly correct, there may be a case for using a closed economy model rather than an open economy model. So, first thing I'd like to do is we copied, no question, we copied your four-sector model in doing our paper, including a little trick with agriculture. So in the perfect substitution case, that is where you're price takers and where the rates of return are equalized all around the world, I want to contrast the results that we got. And so in the model that you presented, or the data that you presented, the burden on labor was 130%, and ours it was 71%. And these are with the same elasticity, so the question is, why are those numbers very different? We also found 36% of the burden on capital, while you actually found capital gained 14%. And our corporate sector is so little, not much ever happens to it. You might have a little bigger agricultural sector than we do have. These are very different results, even with the same elasticities. Well, why is that? So I'm going to give you a little math here. So this is a very simple formula for the labor's nominal burden, that is not taking into account prices, the effects on prices. The total labor supply in the economy comes to change in wages, which is equal to this term times the change in tax. This was technically, I should have had a minus here. Where L is the total labor in the U.S., K is the total capital, L1 is the labor in the corporate tradable sector, K1 is capital in the corporate tradable sector, K2 is capital in the corporate non-tradable sector, and S is the share of world capital. So this is, in this simple model where you have perfect substitution, this is the formula that you can derive for this incidence equation. Okay, so factor intensities turn out to be very important. Let's consider the case where, S is the share of the world output that the U.S. has. So let's just set S equal to 0 for now. And we're just looking at the first term. Now, what we have in our model is a much more labor-intensive, relative to the rest of the economy, corporate tradable sector. Why is that so labor-intensive? We might think of services as more labor-intensive, but don't forget that services also include housing. That's a big part of the non-corporate, non-tradable sector, and that's very, very capital-intensive. Same thing is true with the corporate non-tradable sector, where you have utilities, which are also extremely capital-intensive. So we try to estimate these relationships, but we have, instead of our labor in the corporate sector, tradable sector being 20%, it's actually a third. So where you multiply by 5, we would multiply by 3. The other thing, for the same reason, we find the capital used in the corporate capital used in the corporate tradable sector share, which is the other number, is also much smaller for the same reason, because of the labor intensities. So where you would get, in this sort of simple case, without considering price effects, without considering a big economy, in other words, this would be a little economy case, you get 250%, and we get 100%. By sheer chance, we actually get the same incidence, that occurs with just a one good model. So the lesson in this, I think, is very, very important when you're doing any kind of incidence in this kind of model to think about how capital intensive the particular sector you're looking at is. So that's one reason for the difference. Now, the second term, which is accounting for the big economy, when we correct for that second term, the 250% in Professor Harberger's model falls to 219%, and our 100% falls to 84%. Not much difference. We have a slightly bigger little share. We have a different labor ratio. We have everything's a little bit different, but they do lower them and a little more in terms of absolute percentages and his numbers. Now, the other thing that makes the difference, again, we don't have 219% and 84%. We have 130% and 71%. Those differences are due to the price effects. So that because of these much bigger effects on wages, the price effects in the Harberger economy are much bigger than the price effects in our economy. So that's the reason for, oops, went too far here. That's the reason for the differences in these two models. And it does mean that if you're going to study corporate tax incidence, you do need a multi-sector model to study it, because these kinds of factor intensities are going to make a lot of difference. Okay, so now the other thing that makes the difference in our model, and I admit that we thought there was a case for low elasticities, but we did present a huge range of those results, both in a graph and tables. But clearly these elasticities, now the two elasticities that we looked at, one is a portfolio elasticity, that is the substitutability of capital across countries, and the other is the product substitution between domestic tradable goods and imports. And as you can see, now that 0% for capital with produced capital growth should actually be 100%. That's just a typo. But let's just ignore that for a minute. This is something we did in our table, in our model, to just really try to bring some more realistic analysis into it, really based largely on some things that Harry Grubert persuaded us were very important. But if you look, you can see as you go from perfect substitution, we have 36% on capital, 71% on labor. If you go to elasticities of 3 for each of our elasticities, you get less than 20% on labor, 3/4 on capital. So that's why we say we're moving back into the world where capital actually bears most of the tax. Now, actually 3 is it a high elasticity or a low elasticity? As you know, 3 is a lot longer to infinity in terms of elasticity than it is on the number line. But this elasticity of 3 is actually consistent with a lot of empirical evidence that we cite in our paper about the substitutability of direct investment by multinational corporations. So based on the empirical evidence, that number seems to be a reasonable number. The portfolio elasticities, the product elasticities also, we really actually took from either assumptions that other people used or empirical evidence. Maybe they're wrong, but there is a lot of evidence, empirical evidence, that imports and domestic production are not perfect, are far from perfect substitutes. But you can quibble about this. But the point is that these elasticities both can matter very much. Okay, so there's another very important issue here, and that's the issue of debt finance. I started working on this once before, and then I kind of got sidetracked. But I think this is a very important issue to think about. If you believe that it is debt that is very mobile and equity that's not, and if you sort of recognize that a lot of the capital held in the rest of the world is actually much more likely to be debt. In other words, we're kind of unusual, along with the UK, in having a lot of equity capital from a sort of historical development of stock corporations. And then if you recognize something else, which is in our corporate income tax, debt is actually subsidized. where we have a positive tax at the corporate level on equity, we have a negative tax on debt. And that's because we allow the full deduction of nominal interest, so that we allow, basically inflation, the inflation piece of the nominal interest rate. There's a paper that has been done at CBO recently by Bill Randolph that actually calculates some of those tax rates, and they're pretty significant. So it's possible then, it seems to me, that if debt is subsidized and debt is very substitutable and equity is not very substitutable, that you could reverse the whole capital flow. I mean, you could actually end up causing labor to gain because capital flows into the country instead of out of the country. And I think that's an issue that's very important to think about when you're really trying to call the issue of tax incidence. In fact, I remember when I worked at Treasury on the corporate tax integration, there was a great deal of concern about a proposal called CBIT to disallow interest deductibility because of this concern about what getting rid of the corporate tax subsidy for interest could do to the flow of capital. So I think that's actually another reason on top of, in other words, I really think these numbers are conservative because we really haven't accounted for debt finance as it's actually treated in the tax system. Finally, there's a very interesting notion here again. Should we use an open or closed economy? And I construe that to be saying, if we were to repeal our corporate tax, would the rest of the world stay exactly as they are, or would they change? If we were to raise our corporate tax, would they change? Well, again, and I'm having to be grateful to Bill Randolph for many things right now, but he's also done a study which tried to look at the convergence of tax rates around the world, and what he found is there's a tendency actually for tax rates to be very similar and to move in similar directions. Now, if you have a world like that, where there's going to be a lot of response to your change in taxes, then in fact you are back into the closed economy model. I think that's the other one caveat to, and I don't think it's a very important one, but worth saying, is this is all modeling a territorial tax, a source-based tax. And we really don't have a pure source-based tax. We have a residence-based tax with a foreign tax credit and a deferral and, some future tax on repatriation. Who knows how far that moves our tax from a territorial to a residence tax? But if you had pure residence taxes, again, you would go back to the closed economy result because your capital would bear the same tax no matter where it went. So I think that's... So I keep coming back to this. Your work has inspired me to write two of the most intellectually rewarding papers I've ever written. One was with Larry Kotlikoff and looking at another model of corporate tax incidence, and the other was with Kent. But no matter what I do, I keep coming back to the fact that you were right in 1962. So that's what I still think.
I guess so.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so we're still behind. Let's take a few questions.
I think we have. Is that where you're supposed to be?
You're here. I got your name. Okay. We'll take a few questions, and we have a reception where we can continue to talk about this. So I think I saw Harry's hand first.
I've been arguing with Jane about this for about 15 years, and that's the question of the terms of trade effect and the effects of differentiating goods. It seems to me the problem is she only looks at steady state, even for growing steady state. And if you looked at the whole path, this differentiated good effect basically washes out, because if you raise the tax, the capital flows out, your terms of trade go down. When the income comes down, the capital income comes back, your terms of trade improve. In present value terms, those will wash out. Why you attribute any significance to them has never been very clear. And once you look at the whole path, well, the effect of the income going out and the effect of the capital going out, the income coming back.
Well, Harry, the last time our paper was rejected by an argument that sounded very much like yours, frankly, we went back and actually spent some time talking about this. And I think, the thing is, I think it's true. There's a shift the demand curve shift in one direction in the short run and in the other direction in the long run. But in the short run, I think there's still a case to be made that labor's not going to bear the tax. In the short run, the firms can't change their capital stocks, so they have to eat both the direct tax and the demand shift. So I think
rates could change in anticipation of it.
well, that's one of those little tiny nuances that I think we ought to leave out of this model. But in that case, what you're really having is capital bearing more than 100% tax in the short run, when capital stock can't be changed, and then labor, then our steady state. So basically, the shift in the short run trade-off of what happens in the long run in present value doesn't harm labor. I think it harms capital. So we put a discussion of that issue in our paper now, and I'll be happy to send the latest copy to you so you can read what we had to say.
Kevin.
First, I want to thank Carrie for help with that report. I just wonder, Jane and Al, if there's something in the data that could help us think about this. So I just did this big panel study of wages and their response to taxes, and I got something that looked to me like, when I was doing back of the envelope, a lot of support for Al's position. And like the intuitive way to say it is that, geez, in Ireland they went from having half the U.S. manufacturing wage to having the U.S. manufacturing wage by cutting the corporate tax a lot. So it seems to me that there are patterns in the data that could help inform us on this, and I wonder if you think it's possible, and then what to do. Is it like, just, are you moved by the Irish wage response?
Well, Ireland is not one of my countries, let me say.
Looks like it's one of mine.
But in a different way.
No, in economics. No.
Okay, good. No, here I want to go back to where I started and say that we have to be careful in terms of how we pose our questions and how we bring data to bear and all of this. I thought I made an eloquent plea that what we were dealing with was a all by itself change of the corporate tax rate, either in the whole world or in one country. Now that's a clean case with no other distortions and with no such changes. Now, when you start bringing in the issue that the U.S. subsidizes debt, I would say, well, by God, we subsidize housing too. And when you say, well, the capital is going to move out of or into the corporate sector and into or out of housing, and we talk about incidents, what are we going to say about what's going on in that housing part of the story? And it's really a very complicated thing. And I believe that it is still in our heads that we want to do our debating by artful choice of parameters rather than by trying to lard in a lot of specific characteristics of specific countries. One of the things that you can use as a calibration is that Jane has spent most of her professional life worrying about the U.S. economy, U.S. economy, U.S. economy all the time. And I have spent most of my professional life worrying about other economies most of the time. And it leads to a different mindset as you approach these things. I just wanted to mention before I give up the floor 2 things. One, on the elasticity of substitution of 3 among tradable goods. That an elasticity of 1 is something at which the marginal revenue is 0, where whoever has that degree of market power can raise get more money by producing less. And so he gets more total revenue and less total cost. So that's the case where I was taught no monopolist will ever work in the area where the elasticity of demand facing that monopolist is less than one. He'll raise the prices to the point where it's not true anymore. This elasticity of substitution of 3 implying a typical elasticity of 1.5 for the pairwise good that you're talking about, it implies a lot of market power. For Harry, I would just respond that in the world of tradables and non-tradables, movement of the real exchange rate does not change the terms of trade. Terms of trade is that all tradables go up and all tradables go down with the movement of the real exchange rate, with the flow of capital out and the flow of capital in. So the imports and exports go up and down in price together. And it isn't the
I thought the tradables were differentiated, so they didn't really go down together.
Well,
Whose world are we in?
Well, no, but here we get into this is the kind of thing that's worth talking about. The amount of we've had exchange rates with Japan that have moved by a factor of 2. Real exchange rates have moved over by a factor of 2 or nearly 2 over the course of the last 10 years or so. And over a longer time by much more than 2 if you go all the way back when they started to the early 60s, for example. So, what do you think is going to happen to the relative prices of Toyotas and General Motors cars or something like that in that framework? Do you think that I'll agree there's a fillip there that will happen, but there are so many of such things in a complex world that I want to grasp onto this. I don't think of straw. I think of it as an iron bar of the firm skeleton of economic theory, so to speak, that, by God, the right way to think of real exchange rate movements isn't your big elevator in which all the tradables go up and all the tradables go down together. And start deviating too much from that, and you get into a world where you try to grab something and it sort of melts in your hand. That's my problem.
All right. With that, I'm going to call it. We will go to the reception, and we'll allow.
Can I ask one question?
Very quickly.
Who said that that tax incentive that expired on repatriation has led to a lot? Who said that? Was it you, Alan? Good. I got to talk to you. Thank you.
And off to the reception and dinner.